Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into a world that history has somehow made look far cooler than it actually was. The age of American outlaws in the 1800s. Not the slow-motion movie kind, not the perfectly dressed gunslinger leaning dramatically in a dusty street. But the real version. The one where your horse smells worse than your problems, your boots are always slightly damp, and your entire retirement plan depends on not getting recognised by someone who really hates you. Because when people imagine outlaws, they picture freedom. Wide open land, no boss, no rules, maybe a dramatic sunset and a hat tilted just right. But the reality was often closer to sleeping in the dirt, eating whatever didn't run away fast enough, and constantly wondering if that distant rider on the horizon was just passing through, or about to ruin your entire week. So before we settle into this strange, dusty chapter of history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this kind of slow wandering through the past. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always interesting to imagine these stories quietly unfolding somewhere across the world, while someone else is just trying to fall asleep. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Get comfortable, and let everything from the modern world gently fade into the background. And just for a moment, consider a few things. What does it actually feel like to live outside the law? Not for a day, but for years. How long could someone really survive with a price on their head? Was outlaw life thrilling, or mostly just long stretches of boredom interrupted by brief moments of panic? Did they really trust each other, or was every partnership quietly temporary? And what happens when the world around you slowly changes, but you don't? Now. Because tonight, we're not chasing legends. We're following the people behind them. Let's take a closer look at a time when the American frontier was still unfinished, when towns appeared faster than laws could keep up, and when some men decided that instead of living inside that system, they would simply step outside it. And so, the year is somewhere in the mid-1800s. The land is wide, the rules are unclear, and somewhere in the distance, a story is already beginning. The American frontier in the 1800s was not a finished place, but something constantly forming, like wet ink on paper that had not yet dried. Towns appeared almost overnight, built from wood and hope, while vast stretches of land in between remained quiet and uncertain. Laws existed, but they travelled slowly, often arriving long after the people who needed them most. In this environment, opportunity and chaos lived side by side, and it was not always clear where one ended and the other began. At this point, the idea of America as a settled nation was still more of a promise than a reality. Maps showed boundaries, but on the ground those lines were often meaningless. A town might exist in name, but its streets could still be nothing more than packed dirt, its buildings leaning slightly as if unsure of their own future. The frontier was not empty, but it felt unfinished, as though it were waiting for something or someone to define it. What made this more complicated was the pace at which everything changed. A quiet settlement could transform into a bustling town in a matter of months, drawn by the discovery of gold, fertile land, or a new railroad route. With that sudden growth came people of every kind: farmers, merchants, labourers, and those who preferred to live just outside the rules that governed everyone else. It created a strange balance, where stability and instability existed at the same time. The land itself added to this feeling. Wide plains stretched endlessly under open skies, while distant mountains seemed to sit quietly, watching everything unfold below. The wind moved freely, carrying dust across the landscape, and at night the silence could feel almost overwhelming. It was a place that offered possibility, but also demanded endurance. In such a setting, the absence of strong immediate authority became noticeable. Laws written in distant cities had little weight in places where enforcement was uncertain. A disagreement over land, a missing horse, or a broken promise could quickly escalate, not because people were inherently violent, but because there were few systems in place to resolve conflict peacefully. The frontier did not create these tensions, it simply revealed them more clearly. And yet for many this unfinished world was exactly what drew them in. The uncertainty carried a kind of quiet appeal. It suggested that a person could start again, that the past might matter less out here, where everything was still being built. It was a place where identity could shift, where a farmer could become a merchant, and where, in some cases, a law-abiding citizen could slowly become something else entirely. This was the setting in which the idea of the outlaw would begin to take shape, not as a sudden rebellion, but as a natural extension of a world that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. And so the frontier continued to grow, quietly and unevenly, leaving behind a landscape where stories were not yet finished, only just beginning. For many settlers, the difference between lawful living and desperate choices was surprisingly small. A failed harvest, a lost job, or a bad season could quietly push someone toward decisions they might never have considered before. In a place where resources were scarce and stability fragile, survival often came first, and the idea of right and wrong sometimes shifted depending on circumstance. But this was only part of the story. Life on the frontier demanded a kind of resilience that was difficult to maintain over time. Each day brought new uncertainties, weather that could destroy crops overnight, illnesses that had no reliable treatment, or simple misfortune that arrived without warning. These were not dramatic events, but slow pressures, building gradually until they became impossible to ignore. What made this more complicated was the lack of safety nets. In established cities there were systems, however imperfect, that could offer some form of support. On the frontier, those systems were often absent. A person who lost everything did not have many options. There were no easy ways to recover, no clear path back to stability. In such conditions, survival became a deeply personal responsibility. This environment created a quiet tension between intention and necessity. A person might begin with every intention of living within the law, but find themselves facing choices that felt less like decisions and more like inevitabilities. Taking what was needed, bending a rule, or stepping outside accepted boundaries could begin as small acts, justified by immediate need. Over time, these small acts could accumulate. Each one might seem reasonable on its own, but together they formed a gradual shift. The line between lawful and unlawful behavior did not disappear, it simply became harder to see. It moved, subtly, shaped by circumstance rather than principle. The sensory reality of this life reinforced that shift. The constant exposure to the elements, the physical exhaustion of daily work, and the quiet isolation of the landscape all contributed to a mindset focused on the present moment. Long-term consequences felt distant compared to immediate needs. Hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty were far more tangible than abstract ideas of legality. And yet, even within this shifting boundary, there was rarely a sense of chaos. People still operated with their own internal codes, shaped by personal values and the expectations of those around them. The difference was that these codes were flexible, adapting to the demands of the environment. This flexibility was not always comfortable. It carried a quiet weight, a sense that each decision mattered in ways that were not always visible at the time. A single choice could set a direction that was difficult to reverse, leading gradually toward a life that looked very different from what had once been imagined. And so, on the frontier, the path toward becoming an outlaw was not always marked by a single moment of defiance. More often, it was a series of small steps, taken quietly, each one shaped by the simple and persistent need to survive. Outlaws were rarely born into that identity. More often, they drifted toward it through a series of small turns, missed opportunities, unfair treatment, or simple bad luck. A disagreement might escalate, a mistake might linger too long, and before long, a person could find themselves outside the system entirely. It was not always a dramatic transformation, but a gradual one, shaped by the unpredictable nature of frontier life. At this point, it becomes clear that the idea of becoming an outlaw was less about intention and more about direction. Few people set out with a plan to live beyond the law. Instead, they moved toward it almost unconsciously, guided by circumstances that made other options seem less available. What made this more complicated was the way reputation worked in these communities. News travelled quickly, often carried by word of mouth, shaped and reshaped as it moved from one person to another. A single incident could grow in significance, turning a minor conflict into something more serious. Once a name became associated with trouble, it was difficult to separate the person from the story. This created a kind of momentum. A person who had been involved in one questionable situation might find themselves treated with suspicion, even in places where nothing had actually happened. Opportunities became limited, trust became harder to earn, and the path back to ordinary life grew narrower. The physical reality of the frontier reinforced this process. Movement was constant. People travelled between towns, camps, and open land, rarely staying in one place for long. This mobility made it easier to leave behind a past, but it also made it harder to build a stable future. Without strong connections or consistent work, a person could drift, moving further away from structured society. There was also a certain practicality to this shift. Once someone found themselves outside the law, returning to it was not always straightforward. Legal consequences, personal conflicts, and the simple difficulty of starting over created barriers that were not easily overcome. In many cases, continuing along the same path felt like the only option, and yet this life was not without its own form of order. Outlaws often developed their own routines, their own expectations, and their own ways of navigating the world. These systems were informal, shaped by experience rather than written rules, but they provided a sense of structure in an otherwise uncertain environment. The emotional landscape of this transition was subtle. There was rarely a clear moment of realization, no single point at which someone declared themselves an outlaw. Instead, it was something that became apparent over time, recognized only in hindsight. And so the making of an outlaw was not a sudden event, but a quiet transformation, one that unfolded gradually, shaped by the land, the people, and the circumstances that defined life on the frontier. Frontier towns were lively but often unstable places. Saloons, general stores, and dusty streets created the appearance of civilization, yet behind it all was a constant sense of uncertainty. Law enforcement was limited, and justice could be inconsistent. In such places, reputation mattered as much as any written rule, and a single event could quickly change how a person was seen. But this surface activity concealed a deeper unpredictability. Towns were often built quickly, with little time for careful planning. Buildings stood close together, constructed from available materials, their walls thin enough to carry the sounds of daily life from one space to another. Conversations, arguments, and laughter blended into a constant background noise that defined the atmosphere. What made this more complicated was the diversity of the people who passed through. Travellers arrived from different regions, bringing with them their own customs, expectations, and ways of resolving conflict. In the absence of strong, consistent authority, these differences sometimes created tension, not through intention, but through misunderstanding. The saloon, often seen as the centre of social life, reflected this complexity. It was a place of rest, conversation, and temporary escape from the demands of the day. But it was also a place where disagreements could emerge, shaped by alcohol, fatigue, and the close quarters of shared space. The line between calm and conflict was often thin, and it could shift quickly. Outside, the streets carried their own rhythm. Dust settled slowly under the movement of boots and horses, while the sun cast long shadows that changed throughout the day. Shops opened and closed, wagons arrived and departed, and the town itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the flow of people. In this environment, formal systems of justice struggled to keep pace. A sheriff or local authority might exist, but their ability to enforce rules depended heavily on cooperation and circumstance. There were times when order was maintained, and times when it was not, creating a pattern that felt uneven and unpredictable. This inconsistency shaped how people behaved. Without reliable systems to rely on, individuals often turned to personal judgment, deciding for themselves how to respond to situations. This could lead to a sense of independence, but it also carried risks, as different interpretations of fairness could conflict. And yet, despite these challenges, towns continued to function. People adapted, finding ways to coexist within the uncertainty. Relationships formed, routines developed, and a sense of community emerged, even if it was fragile. In such places, the concept of order was not absent, but constantly negotiated, shaped by the people who lived there and the circumstances they faced. The figure of the sheriff is often imagined as steady and heroic, but the reality was more complicated. Many sheriffs were underpaid, under-equipped, and responsible for large, difficult territories. Their authority depended as much on personal respect as it did on official power. In some cases, they were deeply committed to order. In others, they were simply trying to keep up with a world moving faster than they could manage. At this point, it becomes clear that the role of the sheriff was less about control and more about balance. They stood between the written law and the practical realities of the frontier, attempting to apply one within the limits of the other. This required not only strength, but patience and a deep understanding of the people they served. What made this more complicated was the scale of their responsibility. A single sheriff might be tasked with overseeing an area that stretched far beyond what could be easily managed. Travel was slow, communication limited, and assistance not always available. Decisions often had to be made quickly, without the benefit of support or confirmation. The daily work of a sheriff was rarely dramatic. It involved routine tasks, resolving disputes, maintaining order, and responding to incidents as they arose. These tasks required consistency rather than spectacle, and much of their effectiveness came from their ability to build trust within the community. This trust was not guaranteed. It had to be earned, often through repeated interactions and careful judgment. A sheriff who acted unfairly or inconsistently could quickly lose the confidence of those around them, making their role even more difficult. In contrast, one who demonstrated fairness and reliability could maintain a sense of stability, even in uncertain conditions. The physical environment added to these challenges. Long rides across open land, exposure to weather, and the constant movement required to fulfill their duties created a level of fatigue that was not always visible. The work was steady, demanding, and often unrecognized. And yet, despite these difficulties, many sheriffs continued to carry out their responsibilities with a quiet determination. They were not always successful, and they were not always remembered, but their presence contributed to the gradual development of order on the frontier. Their role also highlighted the limitations of the system itself. No single individual could fully manage the complexities of a rapidly changing environment. The sheriff was not a solution, but part of an ongoing process, one that reflected both the strengths and the challenges of the society they served. In this way, the figure of the sheriff becomes less of a symbol and more of a participant in a larger story, a story still unfolding, shaped by the same uncertainties that define the frontier itself. Travel across the frontier was slow and often lonely. Riders moved through open land with little guarantee of what they might encounter. A journey that began quietly could change without warning, shaped by weather, terrain, or the presence of others on the same path. For outlaws, every road carried both opportunity and risk, and the horizon rarely promised safety. At this point, the act of travelling becomes something more than movement. It becomes a way of life. Days were measured not by clocks, but by distance covered, by the shifting position of the sun, and by the condition of the horse beneath them. The rhythm was steady, almost meditative, yet always shadowed by the awareness that anything could change without notice. What made this more complicated was the unpredictability of the land itself. Trails were not always clearly marked, and what appeared to be a simple route could quickly become difficult. Rivers might swell after rain, turning crossings into hazards. Dust storms could rise slowly and then all at once, blurring the world into a muted haze. Even the quietest landscape held small uncertainties that required constant attention. The sensory experience of travel was subtle but persistent. The sound of hooves pressing into dry earth created a steady, repetitive rhythm. The creak of leather saddles, the soft movement of wind across open plains, and the occasional distant call of an animal formed a kind of quiet background. It was not silence, but something close to it, a stillness that encouraged thought. For those living outside the law, this stillness was both comfort and tension. It offered space to think, to reflect, and to rest from the demands of towns and people. But it also left room for worry. Every distant shape on the horizon had to be considered. Was it another traveller, a group, or something less predictable? The answer was rarely clear at first glance. This uncertainty shaped behaviour. Riders learned to move carefully, to observe before acting, and to trust their instincts. They avoided unnecessary risks, but they could never avoid risk entirely. Even familiar routes carried the possibility of change, influenced by the movements of others and the shifting conditions of the land. There was also a quiet sense of isolation. Long stretches of travel meant long periods without conversation, without the presence of others. This isolation could be calming, allowing thoughts to settle into a slower rhythm. But over time, it could also create a sense of distance, not just from other people, but from the structured world they had left behind. And yet, despite all of this, the road continued to draw them forward. It offered movement, and with movement came possibility. Each journey, no matter how uncertain, suggested that something might be found, whether it was opportunity, safety, or simply the continuation of the path itself. So the rider moves on, steady and watchful, across a land that offers no guarantees, only distance, and the quiet promise of whatever might come next. Robbery in the 1800s was not always the dramatic event later stories would suggest. It was often tense, uncertain, and brief. Targets such as stagecoaches or trains were chosen carefully, but success was never guaranteed. Even a well-planned attempt could unravel quickly, and the consequences of failure were severe. The act itself was only a small part of a much larger and more complicated life. But this was only part of the story. The preparation that led up to such moments often took far longer than the act itself. Planning required patience, watching routes, learning schedules, and observing patterns that might not be immediately obvious. It was a quiet process, built on attention rather than action. What made this more complicated was the reliance on timing. A delay of even a few minutes could change everything. A stagecoach might arrive earlier than expected, or later, carrying different passengers or different guards. A train could be accompanied by additional security or none at all. Each variable added a layer of uncertainty that could not be fully controlled. The moment itself, when it came, was usually brief. There was little room for hesitation. Actions had to be clear, deliberate, and efficient. The goal was not spectacle, but completion. To take what was needed and move on before circumstances shifted. The longer the moment lasted, the greater the risk became. The sensory experience of such events was often compressed into a few intense impressions. The sound of movement, the tension in the air, the awareness of others reacting, these details stood out sharply, even as everything else seemed to fade. It was not chaos, but a focused kind of urgency. And yet, despite the intensity, these moments were rarely as dramatic as later stories would portray them. There were no guarantees of success, no certainty of outcome. Even the simplest plan could encounter unexpected resistance or complication. A single mistake could alter the course of everything that followed. Afterward, the pace slowed again. What had been a brief moment of action returned to the longer rhythm of travel and waiting. The outcome, whether successful or not, became just one part of an ongoing sequence rather than a defining event. There was also a practical understanding among those involved. The risks were known, even if they were not always spoken aloud. Each attempt carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment, shaping future decisions and possibilities. In this way, robbery was not the centre of the outlaw's life, but a part of it, one that required attention, preparation, and acceptance of uncertainty. It was less about drama, and more about navigating a series of choices within a world that offered few certainties. And so, the story moves forward, not with sudden excitement, but with a quiet awareness of how much depends on moments that pass almost as quickly as they arrive. Outlaws spent far more time waiting than acting. Between robberies or conflicts, days could stretch into quiet routines of travel, rest, and planning. These in-between moments were filled with small tasks and long conversations, where uncertainty lingered quietly beneath the surface. It was a life defined not by constant action, but by long pauses. At this point, the rhythm of life becomes clearer. The gaps between events were not empty, they were simply slower. Time expanded, filling itself with repetition and small details that might otherwise go unnoticed. A morning might pass with simple tasks, while an afternoon faded into quiet conversation or solitary thought. What made this more complicated was the balance between rest and readiness. Even in moments of calm, there was always an awareness that circumstances could change. This awareness did not always create tension, but it shaped behavior. Actions were measured, movements considered, and plans kept flexible. The sensory world during these periods was gentle and steady. The warmth of the sun, the gradual shift of light across the landscape, and the subtle sounds of wind and movement created an environment that encouraged stillness. It was not inactivity, but a different kind of activity, one that required patience rather than urgency. Conversations, when they happened, were often simple. They did not always focus on plans or concerns, but on shared experiences, small observations, and the passing of time itself. These exchanges helped maintain a sense of connection, even in a life that was often defined by uncertainty. There were also practical tasks to attend to. Equipment needed to be maintained, clothing repaired, and supplies managed. These tasks provided structure, giving shape to days that might otherwise feel unanchored. They were quiet reminders that even in an uncertain life, certain responsibilities remained constant. Yet beneath this calm surface, there was always a quiet awareness of what might come next. The future was not clearly defined, but it was always present in thought. Decisions made during these slower periods could influence what followed, even if that influence was not immediately visible. This contrast between stillness and possibility became a defining feature of the outlaw's life. It created a rhythm that was both steady and unpredictable, where long stretches of calm were occasionally interrupted by moments of change. And so, the days pass quietly, shaped by routine and reflection, while the future waits just beyond the horizon, patient and uncertain. Partnerships among outlaws were often built quickly and tested constantly. Trust was necessary but never complete. Each person carried their own concerns and motivations, and alliances could shift as circumstances changed. In a world without clear structure, relationships were both essential and fragile. But this was only part of the story. Trust in this context was not an absolute condition. It was something that existed in degrees. It was built gradually, through shared experiences and consistent behavior, rather than granted immediately. Even then, it remained cautious, shaped by the understanding that circumstances could change. What made this more complicated was the nature of the environment itself. The frontier encouraged movement, and with movement came new encounters. People met briefly, worked together when needed, and then moved on. These temporary connections required a kind of trust that was practical rather than emotional. The process of forming these partnerships was often subtle. It began with observation, watching how someone behaved, how they spoke, how they responded to situations. Small details mattered. Reliability, consistency, and awareness were valued more than boldness or confidence. There was also an understanding that trust could be tested at any moment. Situations that involved risk or reward often revealed more than words could. Decisions made in these moments carried weight, influencing how relationships developed or dissolved. The sensory environment of these interactions was quiet but present. Conversations took place in low tones, often away from larger groups. The setting, whether open land or a quiet corner of a town, shaped the tone of the exchange. It was not secrecy, but discretion. And yet, despite the caution, these partnerships were essential. Life on the frontier, especially outside the law, was difficult to manage alone. Shared effort made tasks easier, and shared presence provided a measure of stability in an otherwise uncertain world. This balance between necessity and caution defined how trust functioned. It was not something that could be fully secured, but it was something that could be managed. Each person navigated this balance in their own way, shaped by experience and circumstance. And so, relationships formed and shifted, held together by a quiet understanding of their purpose, and the knowledge that they might not last. Reputation travelled faster than people did. Stories, true or exaggerated, spread across towns and territories, shaping how individuals were perceived. For some, this brought fear and advantage. For others, it created pressure and danger. A name could open doors or close them, depending on who was listening. At this point, reputation becomes something more than a collection of stories. It becomes a presence. It arrives before a person does, shaping expectations and influencing interactions before a single word is spoken. In the frontier, where information was often informal, this presence carried significant weight. What made this more complicated was the way stories changed as they travelled. Details were added, removed, or reshaped, influenced by perspective and memory. A single event could be interpreted in different ways, creating multiple versions of the same story. Over time, these versions blended together, forming a narrative that was not entirely accurate but widely accepted. The impact of this process was both practical and psychological. A strong reputation could create opportunities, allowing someone to move through certain situations with less resistance. At the same time, it could attract attention, both wanted and unwanted. Being known meant being recognized, and recognition carried its own risks. The sensory aspect of reputation was subtle. It could be felt in the way people looked, in the slight pause before a conversation began, or in the tone of a greeting. These small signals reflected the underlying awareness of who someone was believed to be, rather than who they actually were. There was also a quiet pressure associated with maintaining a reputation. Once established, it required consistency. Any deviation could create uncertainty, leading others to question what they thought they knew. This pressure influenced behavior, encouraging actions that aligned with expectations, even if they were not always necessary. At the same time, reputation could become a burden. Stories that grew too large could create a distance between the person and their own identity. It became difficult to separate the individual from the narrative that surrounded them. And yet, in a world where formal systems were limited, reputation served as a form of structure. It provided a way for people to understand and anticipate behavior, even in uncertain conditions. It was not always accurate, but it was influential. So the name travels ahead, quietly shaping the path forward. Long before the person ever arrives, ordinary people played a quiet but important role in the world of outlaws. Shopkeepers, travellers, and townsfolk often noticed more than they said. Information passed subtly, sometimes helping law enforcement, sometimes protecting those outside it. The frontier was not just a place of individuals, but of constant observation. At this point, it becomes clear that the frontier was never truly as empty or unnoticed as it might seem. Even in the smallest settlements, there was always a quiet awareness moving beneath the surface. People watched, not out of suspicion alone, but out of habit. In a place where change arrived quickly, noticing small details became part of daily life. What made this more complicated was the informal nature of that awareness. There were no official systems for gathering information, no structured networks as might exist in larger cities. Instead, knowledge moved through conversation, shared casually in general stores, mentioned quietly over a drink, or passed along in the simple exchange of greetings. The sensory atmosphere of these moments was subtle. The creak of a wooden floor, the low murmur of voices, the occasional pause in conversation when someone unfamiliar entered the room, all of it contributed to a quiet rhythm of observation. No one needed to announce their attention. It was simply there, woven into the environment. For outlaws, this created a kind of invisible pressure. Even in moments of rest, there was an understanding that they were being noticed, even if nothing was said aloud. A glance held a little too long, a conversation that shifted slightly in tone. These were small signals, but they carried meaning. At the same time, the public was not unified in its response. Some individuals chose to share what they knew with authorities, motivated by a sense of duty or personal interest. Others remained silent, either out of indifference, caution, or a quiet sympathy for those living outside the law. This variation added another layer of unpredictability. This balance between observation and silence shaped the flow of information across the frontier. News did not travel in straight lines, but in small, uneven steps. A detail mentioned in one place might take days or weeks to reach another, changing slightly along the way. Yet even with these delays, information remained powerful. There was also a sense of familiarity that developed over time. Regular faces became known, patterns of behavior recognized. When something disrupted that pattern, it stood out immediately. This made it difficult for anyone to remain completely unnoticed for long, and yet despite this constant awareness, life continued at its usual pace. People went about their routines, tending to their work, maintaining their homes, and engaging in daily interactions. The watchfulness did not stop life. It simply existed alongside it. In this way, the public became part of the larger system, not through formal authority, but through quiet presence. Their role was not always visible, but it was always there, shaping events in ways that were often subtle and indirect. And so, the frontier watches, quietly, steadily, even when no one seems to be looking. Evenings on the frontier were calm but uneasy. The quiet of the landscape carried its own weight, broken only by distant sounds and shifting wind. For those living outside the law, nighttime offered both rest and vulnerability. It was a time when thoughts grew louder and the future felt uncertain. At this point, the transition from day to night brought a noticeable change. The warmth of sunlight faded, replaced by cooler air that settled slowly across the land. Colours softened, and the sharp edges of the landscape gave way to shadows that stretched and blended together. What made this more complicated was the way sound carried in the stillness. During the day, movement and activity filled the air with noise. At night, even the smallest sound could seem amplified. The rustle of grass, the distant call of an animal, or the quiet shifting of a horse became more distinct, drawing attention in ways that were difficult to ignore. For those resting on the open land, this created a unique balance between calm and alertness. The body sought rest, but the mind remained attentive, aware of the surroundings in a way that did not fully fade. Sleep came, but often lightly, shaped by the need to remain aware. The sensory experience of these nights was simple but vivid. The sky stretched wide above, filled with stars that seemed closer than they might in more settled places. The ground held the warmth of the day for a short while, gradually cooling as the hours passed. The air carried a quiet stillness, interrupted only occasionally. There was also time for reflection. Without the distractions of movement or conversation, thoughts had space to settle and expand. Past events, present concerns, and uncertain futures moved through the mind in a slow, steady rhythm. It was not always comfortable, but it was inevitable. For Outlaws, this reflection often carried a quiet weight. The choices that had led them to this life were not always distant memories. They remained present, shaping how the future was imagined. The night provided space for these thoughts, whether welcomed or not. And yet, there was also a sense of peace in these moments. The absence of immediate demands allowed for a kind of stillness that was difficult to find elsewhere. Even with uncertainty, there was a brief pause, a moment where nothing needed to be done, only experienced. This dual nature of the night, both restful and uncertain, became a defining part of life on the frontier. It reminded those who lived there that even in stillness, the world continued to move quietly around them. And so, the night settles in, calm, watchful, and quietly filled with everything left unspoken. As railroads expanded across the country, they changed everything. Travel became faster, communication improved, and isolated areas grew more connected. For Outlaws, this meant both new opportunities and new challenges. The world they knew was beginning to move in a different direction. At this point, the arrival of the railroad introduced a new rhythm to the frontier. Where movement had once been slow and uncertain, it now became more predictable. Tracks cut across the land in long, deliberate lines, linking distant places in ways that had not been possible before. What made this more complicated was the speed at which these changes occurred. A town that had once been quiet and isolated could suddenly become a centre of activity, filled with new faces and new possibilities. The steady arrival of trains brought goods, information, and people in a continuous flow. The sensory experience of the railroad was distinct. The distant rumble of an approaching train carried across the land long before it arrived. The sound grew gradually, building into a steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with the quiet of the surrounding landscape. When the train passed, it brought movement, noise, and a sense of connection to places far beyond the immediate horizon. For Outlaws, this transformation created new opportunities. Trains carried valuable goods and money, making them potential targets. At the same time, the increased presence of people and the improved communication made it more difficult to operate unnoticed. The balance between these opportunities and challenges required careful consideration. Actions that might have been possible in a more isolated environment now carried additional risks. The presence of railroads meant that information could travel quickly, reducing the time available to move or adjust. There was also a broader sense that the frontier itself was changing. The open spaces that had once defined it were becoming more structured, shaped by the needs of a growing and increasingly connected society. This shift did not happen all at once, but gradually, through the steady expansion of tracks and towns. For many, this change represented progress, a movement towards stability and order. For others, it signalled the loss of a certain kind of freedom, a narrowing of the spaces where alternative ways of living could exist. And so, the railroad moved forward, steady and unstoppable, carrying with it a new version of the world, one that would leave less room for the one that came before. With the growth of infrastructure and law enforcement, crime itself began to shift. What had once been possible in remote areas became more difficult as systems improved. Outlaws had to adapt, often finding that the spaces where they once operated were slowly disappearing. But this was only part of the story. The nature of crime did not simply disappear, it changed shape. As the environment became more structured, so too did the methods required to navigate it. Simplicity gave way to complexity, and actions that once relied on isolation now required greater planning. What made this more complicated was the increasing coordination among authorities. Communication between towns improved, allowing information to be shared more quickly. Patterns that might once have gone unnoticed became easier to identify, and responses became more organized. The sensory landscape reflected this shift. Towns grew busier, filled with movement and activity. The quiet spaces between them began to shrink, replaced by routes that were more frequently travelled. The sense of isolation that had once defined the frontier became less common. For Outlaws, this meant adapting to a world that no longer offered the same conditions. Familiar methods became less reliable, and new approaches were required. This adaptation was not always successful, and the risks continued to grow. There was also a psychological aspect to this change. The awareness that the environment itself was becoming less forgiving created a sense of pressure. Decisions carried greater weight as the margin for error decreased. And yet, even as these changes took place, the underlying motivations remained. The reasons that had led individuals toward a life outside the law did not disappear simply because the world had changed. They persisted, shaped by new circumstances but rooted in the same fundamental experiences. In this way, crime evolved alongside the frontier, reflecting its transformation. It became less about taking advantage of the open spaces and more about navigating a system that was becoming increasingly defined. And so, the nature of the story shifts, quietly, steadily, as the world itself begins to change around it. Law enforcement became more coordinated over time, with larger efforts to track and capture those who lived outside the law. Possess, marshals, and bounty hunters worked together more effectively, reducing the freedom that outlaws once relied on. The sense of being constantly pursued became harder to escape. At this point, the idea of pursuit becomes more structured. What had once been occasional and uneven efforts began to take on a more organized form. Groups formed with specific purposes, sharing information, and working together in ways that increased their effectiveness. What made this more complicated was the persistence of these efforts. Pursuit was no longer limited to a single location or moment. It extended across regions, following patterns and leads that connected different places. This continuity made it more difficult to find lasting refuge. The sensory experience of this pursuit was often indirect. It could be felt in the absence of safety, in the knowledge that movement was being tracked, even if the trackers were not immediately visible. It was a quiet presence, shaping decisions without always revealing itself. For outlaws, this created a constant need for awareness. Movement became more deliberate, routes chosen with greater care. The balance between action and caution shifted, influenced by the growing reach of those who sought to enforce the law. There was also an element of uncertainty. Pursuit did not always follow predictable patterns, and responses could vary depending on circumstances. This unpredictability added to the complexity of navigating the environment. And yet, despite these challenges, the dynamic between pursuit and evasion continued. Each side adapted to the other, creating a process that evolved over time. It was not a static conflict, but a changing one shaped by the conditions of the frontier. In this way, the rise of organized pursuit marked a significant shift in the story. It signaled a movement toward greater structure, a narrowing of the space in which outlaws could operate. And so, the chase becomes quieter, more deliberate, and harder to escape as the world slowly closes in. Bounty hunters added another layer to the frontier's complexity. Motivated by reward, they operated with their own methods and priorities. Their presence blurred the line between justice and personal gain, creating a world where being hunted was not always predictable. At this point, the structure of law enforcement begins to feel less defined. Unlike sheriffs or marshals, bounty hunters did not always represent a single authority. They moved between territories, guided less by duty and more by opportunity. A name on a poster, a price attached to it, was often enough to set them in motion. What made this more complicated was the independence with which they worked. Without a strict chain of command, their methods varied. Some approached their task with a sense of order, working carefully and deliberately. Others operated with a more flexible approach, adapting quickly to changing circumstances, sometimes blurring the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. The sensory presence of a bounty hunter was often subtle. They did not always announce themselves. Instead, they observed, gathering small pieces of information from the same quiet networks that connected the frontier. A conversation overheard, a pattern noticed, a detail remembered, these became the tools of their work. For those being pursued, this created a different kind of uncertainty. Unlike organized posses, which could be seen and anticipated, bounty hunters often moved quietly, appearing unexpectedly. The absence of clear signs made it difficult to predict when or where they might arrive. There was also a certain practicality in their approach. Success depended on patience as much as action. Tracking required attention to detail, an understanding of movement, and the ability to interpret small changes in the environment. It was less about confrontation and more about timing. Yet beneath this practicality, there was always the presence of motivation. The reward itself shaped decisions, influencing how far someone might go and what risks they were willing to take. This added a layer of unpredictability, as each individual operated according to their own priorities. And still, despite this complexity, bounty hunters became a consistent part of the frontier landscape. Their presence reflected the growing desire for order, even if that order was enforced in uneven ways, and so they moved quietly across the same land as everyone else, not always seen, but always part of the story. Despite the tension, there were moments when life slowed down. Quiet mornings, shared meals, and simple routines provided brief relief from uncertainty. These moments, though small, were essential in maintaining a sense of normalcy in an otherwise unstable life. At this point, the contrast between movement and stillness becomes more apparent. After long periods of travel or tension, even the smallest pause could feel significant. A morning without urgency, a meal taken without interruption. These were not remarkable events, but they carried quiet importance. What made this more complicated was the awareness that such moments were temporary. Stillness did not last, but it was valued precisely because of its brevity. It offered a chance to rest, not just physically, but mentally, allowing thoughts to settle into a calmer rhythm. The sensory world during these times was gentle and grounding. The sound of a fire crackling, the subtle warmth of sunlight, the steady presence of familiar surroundings all contributed to a sense of quiet stability. These details, often overlooked, became more noticeable when everything else slowed down. There was also a sense of routine that emerged, even in an uncertain life. Small tasks repeated themselves, preparing food, maintaining equipment, tending to basic needs. These actions created a structure that helped anchor each day, providing continuity in a world that was otherwise unpredictable. For those living outside the law, these moments of stillness offered more than rest. They provided a brief return to something resembling ordinary life. In these pauses, the distance between who they were and who they had become could feel less pronounced. And yet, even within this calm, there remained an underlying awareness of what lay beyond it. The future, uncertain as always, waited quietly. The stillness did not erase that awareness. It simply softened it for a time. There was also a quiet connection that formed in these moments. Shared silence, simple conversation, and the presence of others created a sense of familiarity. These connections did not always need to be expressed openly to be understood. In this way, stillness became an essential part of the rhythm of life. It balanced the movement, the tension, and the uncertainty, offering a brief but meaningful pause. And so, the day slows. Not to stop, but just long enough to breathe. Injuries carried serious consequences in the 1800s. Without reliable medical care, even minor wounds could become dangerous. For outlaws, this risk was even greater, as access to help was limited. Physical hardship was a constant presence shaping daily decisions. At this point, the physical realities of life on the frontier become more difficult to ignore. The body, often relied upon without rest, carried the burden of every action. A simple injury, something that might be easily treated elsewhere, could quickly become something far more serious. What made this more complicated was the lack of consistent care. Medical knowledge existed, but it was not always accessible. Distance, cost, and circumstance often made treatment difficult to obtain. For those living outside the law, these challenges were even more pronounced. The sensory experience of injury was immediate and persistent. Pain, discomfort, and limitation became part of daily life, influencing movement and decision-making. Tasks that were once simple required more effort, and even rest could be affected. There was also an awareness of vulnerability that accompanied injury. Strength and mobility, often taken for granted, became uncertain. This uncertainty shaped behavior, encouraging caution and careful consideration of risk. Recovery, when it occurred, was gradual and often incomplete. Without proper treatment, wounds could linger, affecting long-term health. The body adapted as best it could, but not always fully. For Outlaws, this reality added another layer of complexity. Access to help was limited, and seeking assistance could carry its own risks. Decisions had to be made carefully, balancing immediate need with potential consequences. And yet, despite these challenges, life continued. Adaptation became necessary, shaping how individuals moved, worked, and interacted with their environment. The presence of injury did not stop the story, it simply changed its pace. In this way, the cost of injury was not just physical, but also practical and emotional. It influenced choices, limited possibilities, and reminded those living on the frontier of their own vulnerability. And so, each step becomes more deliberate, each movement more considered, as the body quietly carries its own history forward. Many outlaws maintained distant connections to places or people they had left behind. These ties lingered quietly, influencing choices and thoughts. The idea of returning was often complicated by the realities of their situation. At this point, the concept of home takes on a different meaning. It is no longer just a place, but a memory, something shaped by distance and time. The details may become softer, but the feeling remains. What made this more complicated was the separation between memory and reality. The place remembered might no longer exist in the same form. People may have changed, circumstances may have shifted, and the passage of time created a gap that could not easily be bridged. The sensory elements of these memories were often vivid. The sound of familiar voices, the sight of known surroundings, the rhythm of a life once lived. These details remained clear, even when everything else had changed. For those living outside the law, these memories could carry both comfort and unease. They offered a reminder of what had been, but also of what could no longer be easily reclaimed. The idea of returning was present, but often uncertain. There was also a sense of distance that extended beyond geography. The choices made along the way created a separation that was not easily undone. Even if the physical journey could be completed, the path back was not always clear. And yet, the pull remained. It appeared in quiet moments, in reflections during stillness, and in the simple awareness of what had been left behind. It was not always acted upon, but it was rarely absent. This connection to the past added depth to the present. It reminded those who felt it that their story did not begin with their current life, and that it extended beyond it as well. In this way, home becomes less of a destination and more of a presence, something carried quietly, shaping thoughts and choices in ways that are not always visible. And so, the memory remains, steady and distant, quietly influencing the path ahead. And so, as the dust slowly settles over these wide and unfinished lands, the story of the American outlaw begins to feel a little quieter than we first imagined. Not quite the sharp, cinematic legend that history sometimes hands us, but something slower, more human, and far more uncertain. Because behind every name that drifted through those frontier towns, there was not just a figure of rebellion, but a person shaped by circumstance, a life that unfolded gradually, one decision at a time, often without a clear sense of where it would lead. The frontier itself did not create heroes or villains in any simple way. It simply revealed people as they were, under pressure, in motion, and often alone with their choices. Some found opportunity, some found hardship, and some found themselves slowly stepping outside the world that was being built around them. But even as that world changed, as railroads stretched further, as towns grew more stable, and as systems became stronger, the space for that kind of life began to narrow, not suddenly, but steadily, until eventually, the frontier itself, once so open, so uncertain, became something more defined, and with it, the age of the outlaw began to fade. What remained were the stories. Stories told and retold, shaped by memory, softened by time, sometimes made larger than they once were. Stories that turned long, quiet days into moments of legend, and uncertain lives into something that felt almost certain in hindsight. But if you listen closely, beneath those stories, there is still something else. The sound of hooves moving steadily across open land, the quiet hum of wind through empty space, the long pauses between moments that mattered, and the sense that life, even then, was rarely as simple as it is often remembered. Now, as you rest here, far from that world, with its dust and distance and uncertainty, it's worth noticing just how much has changed. The quiet comfort of a steady place, the ease of knowing where you are, the absence of that constant watchful uncertainty. Things that might feel ordinary now, but would have seemed almost unimaginable then. So as the story fades, and the frontier drifts a little further into the distance, let your thoughts slow down with it, let the world grow quieter, and just for a moment, rest in the stillness that those long roads never quite allowed. Thank you for spending this time here, and whenever you're ready, I'll be here for the next quiet journey into the past.